Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's pretty fascinating to me, the history of Puerto Rican nationalism. And guiding us through this journey, we've got some great excerpts from Mr. Hutchings History podcast. You know, it's more than just an island fighting for its independence. It's really about what happens when citizenship doesn't necessarily equal power and how people fight for recognition and equality.
Yeah. When you think about it, it really cuts to the core of what citizenship and belonging actually mean, especially in a country as diverse as the United States.
Absolutely. So, set the stage we're talking. Late 19th, early 20th centuries. What were some of the major historical events that really set this movement in motion?
Well, we got to start with the Spanish-American War.
Okay.
So after the war ends in 1898, Puerto Rico becomes a U.S. territory, but its future is very much uncertain at that point. And then in 1917, Puerto Ricans are granted U.S. citizenship.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like a positive development, but I'm guessing there were some pretty significant caveats.
You're exactly right. The citizenship that was granted came without statehood or full political representation in the U.S. government. And it's what historian Charles Venator Santiago calls inclusive exclusion.
Wow, inclusive exclusion. What does that mean exactly in this context, and what kind of impact did that have on the people of Puerto Rico?
It basically means you're part of the nation, but you're kept on the margins. You have this label of citizen, but you lack the power to actually shape the decisions that affect your life. I mean, imagine the frustration of being told that you belong, but then being denied a real voice in your own future.
I can only imagine. How would you say that? This feeling of almost a sense of resentment or a yearning for something more? Was that widespread among Puerto Ricans at the time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This lack of true self-determination, it fueled a growing sense of nationalism. People began to question what it really meant to be American when they were being denied these basic political rights. And this is where we start to see the seeds of the Puerto Rican independence movement really starting to sprout.
So you have this underlying tension, this feeling of being included, but not fully recognized. At what point does that tension start to boil over?
Well, between 1950 and 1954, things escalate pretty dramatically. You see a series of events that really force the world to pay attention to Puerto Rico and the simmering frustrations of its people.
Yeah, this is the period when it seems like the movement really starts to grab headlines. What were some of the key events that made the world take notice?
Well, one event that really shook the nation was the attempted assassination of President Harry Truman in 1950. Two Puerto Rican nationalists, Griselio Torresola and Oscar Collazo, planned and carried out this attack on Blair House, where Truman was actually residing at the time during White House renovations.
That's a bold move, an incredibly risky move. What was their motivation? Did they actually think they could assassinate the president? Or was it more symbolic?
I think it's important to remember the context. For decades, Puerto Ricans had been peacefully advocating for greater autonomy and self-determination. But their pleas were largely ignored. So the assassination attempt, while shocking, was really a desperate act, born out of frustration and this desire to force the issue of Puerto Rico's status onto the national stage.
They were willing to take extreme measures to be heard. What was the outcome of the assassination attempt?
Thankfully, the attempt was foiled. One of the attackers was killed. The other was captured and later sentenced to death. President Truman, deeply shaken by the experience, wrote in his diary, "It's hell to be president."
I can only imagine what a haunting diary entry. You can really feel the weight of that moment and the realization that things had reached a boiling point. Did that event lead to any meaningful changes in U.S. policy toward the island?
Not immediately. In fact, just a few years later in 1954, another shocking event took place. This time, 4 Puerto Rican nationalists, including Lolita Lebron, opened fire from the visitors gallery in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Wow. Attacking the U.S. Congress, that's a major escalation. What was the goal of this attack?
So similar to the assassination attempt on President Truman, this attack on Congress was a calculated act of protest. They weren't necessarily aiming to kill, but to make a statement. That could no longer be ignored. They wanted to force the U.S. government and the American people to confront the question of Puerto Rico's status and its people's right to self-determination.
It's a powerful statement, especially coming from a group who felt they had no other way to be heard. What happened in the aftermath of that attack?
Well, 5 congressmen were wounded, though thankfully no one was killed. Lolita Lebron, who really became a symbol of this movement, famously said during her trial, "I did not come to kill anyone. I came to die for Puerto Rico."
It's a haunting quote. You can really feel the depth of her conviction, and it seems like these acts of violence, while condemned by many, did succeed in grabbing the world's attention.
They did. And they sparked a debate that continues to this day. Were these acts terrorism? Or were they desperate pleas for freedom? From a people who felt they had no other recourse. It's a complex question with no easy answers.
It challenges us to think critically about the length that people will go to when they feel like their voices aren't being heard. But the story of Puerto Rican nationalism, it doesn't end there.
Right. In the mid-20th century, a new chapter unfolds, one that will profoundly impact both the island and the U.S. mainland.
What happens next?
A massive wave of migration begins. Puerto Ricans, driven by economic hardship at home and drawn by the promise of opportunity, begin relocating to the mainland in large numbers.
I can see that. When faced with limited options, people will seek a better life wherever they can find it.
Exactly. But this migration, while driven by hope, would also bring a whole new set of challenges and complexities to this story of Puerto Rican nationalism.
So we've gone from colonial rule, simmering frustration, acts of protest that shook the nation, and now we're on the verge of this mass migration that's bound to reshape the entire landscape. This is where I'll have to pause for now, but we'll pick up the story and explore those new challenges in part 2 of our deep dive.
So as we move into the mid-20th century, this wave of migration really starts to reshape the narrative of Puerto Rican nationalism.
Right.
You know, it's not just about people moving to the mainland for economic opportunity. It's about how this migration intertwines with their identity, their struggles, and their ongoing fight for equality.
Yeah, it's almost like this migration adds another layer to this whole concept of inclusive exclusion that we talked about earlier. They're physically present in the U.S. now, but were they truly accepted and integrated into American society?
Right, and that's the crucial question.
Yeah.
The reality is that many Puerto Ricans arriving on the mainland encountered a very different America than they might have imagined. Instead of open arms and opportunities, they often faced discrimination, systemic racism.
Yeah.
You know, they became, in a sense, doubly excluded.
So even though they were American citizens, their ethnicity and cultural background became barriers to true equality. What were some of the specific challenges that they faced?
Well, a lot of them were relegated to these low-paying jobs, often in factories or agricultural fields. They faced de facto segregation in housing and education, often concentrated in these overcrowded barrios in cities like New York and Chicago.
So they were essentially trapped in this cycle of poverty and limited opportunities. Did this shared experience of hardship and discrimination have an impact on the movement for Puerto Rican nationalism?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that this migration wasn't just a physical journey, it was a cultural and political one as well.
Yeah.
The experience of being Puerto Rican in the U.S. mainland added a new dimension to their identity, and it fueled different forms of activism and resistance.
So we're not just talking about pushing for independence back on the island anymore. The fight for equality is now taking place on U.S. soil as well. Exactly.
On the island, you still had groups like the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, led by Pedro Albizu Campos, who continued to advocate for full independence. They view the U.S. as a colonial power and believed that complete separation was the only path to true self-determination.
And understandably so, given the history that we've discussed. But what about those who had migrated to the mainland? Did they share the same goals?
It's interesting because on the mainland, the focus shifted somewhat. You saw the emergence of groups like the Young Lords, who were inspired by the Black Panthers and other social movements of the 1960s. They took a more localized approach, focusing on issues like police brutality, inadequate health care, and the deplorable housing conditions in their communities.
So while the goal of independence was still important to some others, we're focusing on improving their lives within the existing system. Were these groups at odds with each other, or did they find common ground?
I think there were certainly differences in approach, but both groups recognized the importance of cultural pride and empowerment. They understood that to fight for political change, they needed to instill a sense of shared identity and encourage people to embrace their heritage.
I love that. It's about more than just demanding rights. It's about reclaiming a sense of self and celebrating your culture in the face of oppression.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this emphasis on cultural pride led to some significant victories. One that stands out is the Aspira Consent Decree of 1974.
The Aspira Consent Decree, right? Remind me, what was that all about?
This was a landmark legal victory for Puerto Rican students in New York City. It mandated bilingual education programs in the city's public schools, recognizing that forcing assimilation wasn't the answer.
That's a huge win. It acknowledges the importance of linguistic diversity and paves the way for educational equity.
Exactly. And it was a testament to the power of organized activism. Puerto Ricans, both on the island and the mainland, were finding their voices and demanding to be heard.
So we've seen how this wave of migration added a whole new layer to the story of Puerto Rican nationalism, bringing new challenges, but also fueling new forms of activism.
And it's crucial to remember that this story is far from over. The debate over Puerto Rico's political status continues today, with ongoing discussions about statehood independence or maintaining the current Commonwealth status.
It's a reminder that the issues we're discussing aren't just confined to history books. They have a real impact on people's lives today. But before we get into those present-day implications, I want to take a step back and explore how historians have interpreted this complex and multifaceted movement. Are there different schools of thought when it comes to understanding Puerto Rican nationalism?
Of course, history is never just one single narrative. There are always multiple perspectives, each offering valuable insights.
Let's unpack some of those perspectives. What are some of the key schools of thought when it comes to the history of Puerto Rican nationalism?
Well, you have the progressive school, with historians like Ramon Grossfogel. They view Puerto Rican nationalism through the lens of colonial resistance, emphasizing the economic and political exploitation of the island by the U.S. For them, nationalism is a natural response to oppression.
So it's about understanding the power dynamics and the legacy of colonialism. What are some other perspectives?
Then you have the social history school, with scholars like Vicky Ruiz. They shift the focus to the grassroots nature of the movement, highlighting the role of community organizations, cultural expressions, and the everyday lives of people who were fighting for equality.
It's about recognizing the agency of individuals and communities in shaping their own destiny.
Yeah.
What other schools of thought are there?
There's the revisionist school, with historians like Miriam Jimenez Ramon. They offer a more critical perspective, challenging the romanticized view of nationalism and pointing out internal divisions within the movement. They also question the effectiveness of violent tactics.
So they're trying to present a more nuanced and balanced view of the movement, acknowledging its complexities.
Exactly. And then you have the post-colonial school, with scholars like Juan Gonzalez. They connect Puerto Rican nationalism to a global anti-colonial struggle, seeing it as part of a broader fight against U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean.
So they're placing it within a wider historical context of resistance against colonial powers.
Precisely. And each of these schools of thought offers a unique lens through which to understand this complex and multifaceted movement. It's a reminder that history is constantly being debated, reinterpreted, and reshaped as new evidence emerges and perspectives evolve.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from the early days of colonial rule and the rise of nationalism to acts of protest that shook the nation. We've explored the impact of mass migration and the emergence of new forms of activism on the U.S. mainland. And we've even touched upon the various historiographical interpretations of this complex movement. But as you mentioned earlier, the story doesn't end there. The question of Puerto Rico's status remains a topic of debate even today.
You're absolutely right. The conversation about Puerto Rico's future continues, and it's important to understand how this history informs those discussions.
That's a perfect segue into part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the legacy of this movement and its relevance to the ongoing conversations about Puerto Rico's political status. We've really covered a lot of ground, going back to the roots of Puerto Rican nationalism and how it's evolved over time. But you know what? This history is alive. It continues to shape the island's identity and relationship with the U.S. even today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It's not just about understanding the past, but about using that understanding to grapple with the present.
I agree. Let's talk about the present. What are some of the major issues facing Puerto Rico today, and how does the history of nationalism inform those issues?
Well, the most pressing issue is the question of Puerto Rico's political status. As we've seen, this debate's been simmering for over a century, and it continues to be a source of tension and division.
So what are the options on the table here? I know we've mentioned statehood, independence, Commonwealth status. Could you break those down for us?
Sure. So statehood would mean becoming the 51st state, with full representation in Congress, and the right to vote in presidential elections.
That's great.
Independence, as the name suggests, would mean complete separation from the U.S. Puerto Rico becoming its own sovereign nation. And then Commonwealth status, which is the current arrangement, means maintaining a political association with the U.S., but with limited self-governance.
So it seems like each option has its own pros and cons. What are some of the key arguments for and against these different options?
Let's start with statehood. Proponents of statehood argue that it would grant Puerto Ricans full citizenship rights, including the right to vote for president, and have equal representation in Congress. They also argue that it would boost the island's economy by providing access to more federal funding.
So it seems like the most logical step towards full equality and integration.
Right. But opponents of statehood argue that it would erode Puerto Rico's cultural identity and lead to the loss of its unique language and traditions. They also fear that it would make the island more vulnerable to economic exploitation by U.S. corporations.
Yeah, that's a valid concern given the history we've discussed. What about independence then? What are some of the arguments for and against that option?
Okay, so those who favor independence see it as the only way for Puerto Rico to achieve true self-determination and control its own destiny. They believe it would allow the island to develop its own economic and political systems, free from U.S. influence.
So that sounds appealing in terms of autonomy and self-reliance.
Right. But the reality is, independence would also bring significant challenges. Puerto Rico's economy is heavily dependent on trade with the U.S., and there are concerns about its ability to thrive as an independent nation. There's also questions about its ability to defend itself militarily and maintain stability.
So it's a complex issue, no easy answers. What about maintaining the current Commonwealth status, then? What's the rationale behind that?
Well, those who favor the Commonwealth status argue that it provides
A balance.
between autonomy and the benefits of association with the U.S.
Yeah.
They point to the fact that Puerto Ricans have U.S. citizenship. They can travel freely between the island and the mainland, and they also highlight the economic benefits of that relationship.
But we've already talked about how that inclusive exclusion can lead to its own problems and frustration.
Yeah, and critics of the Commonwealth status argue that it's essentially a colonial arrangement that keeps Puerto Rico in a state of political limbo. They point to the fact that Puerto Rico has no voting representation in Congress and lacks full control over its own affairs.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for ongoing resentment and instability.
Right. And that's the dilemma. There's no easy solution to this complex issue. Each option has its own benefits and drawbacks, and there's no clear consensus among the people of Puerto Rico about the best path forward.
So what does the future hold for Puerto Rico? Where do you see this debate heading?
Well, it's tough to say. The future of Puerto Rico's political status is uncertain. But one thing is clear: the history of nationalism, the fight for equality, the desire for self-determination, all of that will continue to shape the island's destiny.
We've explored so much in this deep dive. The struggle for recognition, the violence that erupted from frustration, the challenges of migration, and this ongoing debate over political status. It's a story that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. A reminder of this enduring human desire for freedom and equality, and the right to determine one's own future.
I agree. And it's a story that has relevance far beyond the shores of Puerto Rico. It speaks to these universal struggles for identity and belonging and self-determination that resonates in so many parts of the world.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through the history of Puerto Rican nationalism. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a deeper understanding of this complex and fascinating story. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep engaging with these important issues.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.